I say you ought to be rich. You have no right to be poor. Well, up for today's discussion is Russell Conwell's Acres of Diamonds. Now, as we mine the depths of our course material, it might be valuable for a moment to pause and remind ourselves of the questions that we should employ with each source that we're asked to read this semester. No matter the source, we should be asking questions like, how is the prosperity gospel constructed in this source? Or you might ask, how are ideas of faith, health, wealth, and victory defined in this source? How are these sources influenced by their historical context? What is the theological and historical impact of these sources? How is this source related to trends and themes found in American culture or contemporary iterations of the prosperity gospel? Finally, how is this source related to the other sources we've read throughout this course? Now, these aren't necessarily questions for course discussion, but they're foundational questions that we need to ask that should help us think about really how to analyze these pieces of writing. So, to talk about Russell Conwell and his Acres of Diamonds, we have to consider the context in which he kind of came of age. So, Russell Conwell emerges in a similar context to that of Ralph Waldo Trine, born 23 years before Trine in 1843. So, Conwell saw the destruction and the bloodshed of the American Civil War, which was a period in American history that caused a theological crisis. American Christians were forced to wrestle with the question, in the face of such great loss, was God good? Was God all-powerful? Did God favor the American experiment? So during the Civil War, Conwell converted to Christianity while recovering from severe injuries sustained during the 1864 Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. And in 1869, Conwell wrote an essay while traveling the Middle East that later inspired his Acres of Diamonds. In the late 19th century, the giant gap between the rich and the poor, it prompted a flurry of Christian responses. From Rauschenbusch's social gospel to the Salvation Army, to only name a few, Christians offered solutions to the swelling ranks of the urban poor. Yet, not all Christians sought to solve the problems inherited from industrialism and immigration. Some Protestants, some Christians directly identified Christianity with America's good fortune, and thus they flocked to any gospel that would explain that the gospel was directly tied to the fits and starts of capitalism. So, before his death in 1925, Conwell delivered Acres of Diamonds as a speech over 6,000 times around the world. In the midst of the tumult and rapidly changing culture, Conwell argued that you don't need to look elsewhere for prosperity and a bright future. All you had to do is look in yourself, maybe even in your community. He promised listeners that wealth lay within their grasp, if only they would accept their Christian duty to work hard and see God's hand at work within the workings of capitalism. And so what Conwell did is he reinterpreted his Calvinist inheritance for a new corporate age, equating poverty with sin and riches with dutiful virtue. Conwell paired theological and fiscal optimism resting on a high view of this human perfectibility. Now, the message then, it required neither inner divinity or even potent words. Great men, and they were men, were once regular people separated from the masses by steely character, right? Conwell preached that the American virtues of innovation, pragmatism, and self-reliance, if you had that, you would be blessed with riches beyond your wildest imagination. Conwell's Wall Street gospel agreed with and baptized the unfettered accumulation by the nation's first millionaires and billionaires, sharing the mythical secrets that brought Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller to the top. Sheer uninhibited will. Which brings me to the discussion question that I'd like you to answer this week. How do you think Russell Conwell would interpret Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 and 24? How do you think Russell Conwell would interpret Jesus' words in Matthew 19, verses 23 and 24? Now, we saw last week that for Trine, on the other hand, he believed that there was like this divine sequence in the universe, and that if humans could achieve harmony within that sequence, call it God, they would be able to find success. Now, Trine believed that humans came from an infinite source of light, and that God and humans were one. However, Conwell's illustration of the man who sold his property in search for diamonds elsewhere, humans set limitations on themselves. And so if they were to just simply pour their lives into hard work, pragmatism, innovation, self-reliance, openness to risk, all they needed was available to them, just as it was for the great American frontiersmen, the wildcatters, fortune seekers. The American dream was realized not simply in those who had heaped up treasures, but who had all the virtues to earn it or discover it all over again. The American dream was realized not simply in those who had heaped up treasures, but those who had all the virtues to earn it or discover it all over again. Well, let's go ahead and dive on into our discussion. In the late 19th century, the Gilded Age's yawning gap between the rich and the poor prompted a flurry of Christian responses. Walter Rauschenbusch's I'm going to start this over.